So I'm going to share a little bit of an opinion I have, and you don't have to agree with my opinion, but a lot of my opinions are based on facts where as I've done things over the years, I've noticed that some things are just more effective or better or more enjoyable than others. When it comes to the games I have, I notice there's a certain commonality that keeps coming up. Yes, there are games that are based on grids, but a lot of my favorite games happen to have a very specific thing. They're based on the hex. Now, something I got to bring up about hexes. Hexes have the most efficient, repeatable shape in nature. And yes, it's a natural shape. You find it in honeycombs and you find it in basalt formations, even if the basalt formation is kind of sloppy. Hexes do make for a more effective tabletop game surface than squares 90% of the time. A grid has the Pythagorean problem. There's a 40% increase if you move or measure diagonally. With hexes, you technically have different problems, but you can more easily choose a direction to move in than the 4 directions you get moving out of a square. Now, hexes do have some stagger, but then again, so does movement on a grid, even if final placement looks organized. Now, there's been a lot of pros and cons to using squares or pros and cons to using hexes, but all in all, it's still just a choice of game design. Now, when talking about game designers, one literalist game designer once commented, "How do you draw a circle with a hex grid?" when the correct question would be, how do you simulate a circle on it? And surely it's far easier to simulate a circle on a hex board than it is on a grid. More so, circles are how we make hexes geometrically. Circling the square has always had mystic qualities to it, but a hex is an accurate flattening of a circle, and you can do that with just a few lines and with other circles. Now, each of the 6 sides represents 60 degrees, tighter than a grid's 90 degrees. Yet if you use the points as well as the edges, it further narrows down to 30 degrees, or the 12 sides of a clock. This allows you to have an amazing placement and motion possibility on a hex mat. Indeed, the sharpest game designers have always opted for hexes over grids. The hex crawl in an outdoor environment is almost a perfect expression of how to take freedom of movement and translate it into a tabletop game play area. The realm where hexes both shine and can be a bit more muddled is with facing. Now, if you're doing like phalanx or shield wall style formations in your combat primarily, grids will do fine. As you can see, this Aztec guy here is being, facing off against these 3. And though they could potentially come up and flank him, by doing so, they would open up the flanks of the person that the Aztec is facing face to face. This also would be completely annulled if there were more figures here. They would just be facing off, pairing off one against the other, and it wouldn't matter if anybody was flanking anybody else, although they could in this situation. They could come over and flank. When it comes to the hex, things get a little bit muddled. In a hex formation, the sealed wall is technically impossible, unless you have instances where you can occupy the line instead of occupying a hex, which, like I said, that makes things extremely fluid, and you can do really well with that. Even then, no effort is required on these 2 to flank the Aztec, and the Aztec also has them all his front facing too, so he can go and just fight to his heart's content. It just depends on whether or not they actually get their flanking bonus in or not through whatever scenario, or they could potentially do this, but that opens up all kinds of possibilities. Hexes would do better if you were just running around freely and there was no concern about formation or rank. Here it's just these 3 ganging up on this poor guy, and he has to deal with it. Hexes are extremely advantageous when you have to worry about consistent movement, like with naval vehicles, with spaceships, with aircraft that are constantly on the move. That really works with hexes very well. I've always liked hexes. And then again, I've always liked fighting and playing games out in open terrain as opposed to in dungeons. So if you're stuck in dungeons, you probably want to stick with a grid. But if you've wandered out into the wider world of gaming, you'll realize there's a bunch of other things to do with your time besides just be codependent upon a grid and D6s. You may want to branch off into hexes and other kinds of dice. Thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you have a terrific rest of your week.